Fallout has had a pretty interesting journey from top-down isometric RPG to a first-person shooter with a unique RPG combat system that still manages to be a shooter, and an RPG for that matter. Fallout is super different from most other gaming, both in terms of story, world building, mechanics, and visuals. The only thing that it's retained over the years is a general aesthetic and feel, as well as an established canon. Other than that, today's Fallout is super different than the Fallout of old. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, the evolution of Fallout. In 1988, a game called Wasteland came out. Wasteland was an open-world role-playing game set in a post-apocalyptic America that had been destroyed by a nuclear holocaust. This should sound pretty familiar, and we'll talk about why in a moment. It was directed by Brian Fargo, developed by Interplay Productions, and published by Electronic Arts. Wasteland was an extremely well-received game. It was given accolades for the mechanics of the game, which laid out the rich plot in an easy-to-manage manner, and by all accounts is actually still unique to this day. Wasteland had a couple of sequels that basically fell out, so to speak. It had a direct sequel that was not made by the original team called Fountain of Dreams that Electronic Arts didn't bother advertising as a sequel to Wasteland, and an actual sequel that took place in the universe of Wasteland but didn't continue the story, was being developed by the original team but got cancelled on account the 8-bit game market wasn't exactly booming by the 1990s. Attempts to continue the world established in Wasteland just didn't work out. But Brian Fargo was determined. Brian Fargo worked for a long time to establish an official sequel to the games that would kind of reboot it, but unfortunately the Wasteland license was eventually sold, and the game that they were developing had to become its own IP. Released in 1997 and considered a spiritual successor to Wasteland, Fallout built on the original ideas that were created by Brian Fargo, adding an aesthetic of a retro futurism. It retained a lot of the elements that they started with, a world very similar, post-nuclear holocaust, sending out a vault dweller into the wasteland to save their home, needing to find a new water recycling system or just some way to get water, so the colony of people dwelling in the vault wouldn't die. Fallout is an open-world turn-based, RPG-styled game using a system devised specifically for the game called Special, which is an acronym for Strength, Perception, Endurance, Charisma, Intelligence, Agility, and Luck. Fallout was originally developed with a license to the GURPS system, an acronym for the Generic Universal Role-Playing System, but eventually they decided they wanted their own system. Special was developed for that reason, and it is still used in the current games. Special is the 7 basic attributes of every character in the game, with perks and various skills which can be leveled up and add a pretty large degree of flexibility. It also has systems that track the moral choices of the character, allowing you to really truly roleplay in the world of Fallout from both a mechanical and a moral perspective. Moral choices are tracked in an attribute called Karma, which will cause the player to receive various different reputations, which act a bit like perks. Because a large amount of the dialogue in Fallout was not voice acted, it was just text, interactions could vary wildly, and deviations to various interactions could be indulged without spending a lot of money. The voice talent that was in the game was, however, top-notch, with everybody from Tony Shalhoub to Brad Garrett, but most importantly, Ron Perlman as the narrator, who does a phenomenal job. Fallout 1 is a landmark in PC RPGs. It wears its influences on its sleeve, from having armor that looks like the Road Warrior's jacket, to having energy weapons that look like Flash Gordon, and a very large number of other 1950s references, architecture, and aesthetic, and its isometric perspective and turn-based combat was very popular at the time. However, Fallout was just unique. It looked very different from a lot of other titles and had a lot of different things to say. Fallout took about 4 years to develop, which is interesting because 1 year later, the sequel, Fallout 2, came out. 1998's Fallout 2 is an improvement on the storyline and world, giving you a much larger open world to exist in and giving you a deeper, more convoluted storyline. Fallout 2 continues usage of special without really doing a lot to it other than adding a few perks here and there, and Fallout 2 sort of built on all of the tech that was developed for the first Fallout, and a lot of it was just updating art and writing a new story. Fallout 2 takes place 80 years after the events of the first Fallout, and ultimately pretty much feels like Fallout, but more of it. That's not a bad thing, because Fallout's a great game. Fallout 2 centers around finding a Garden of Eden creation kit, also known as a GECK, with the intention of jump-starting society in the post-apocalyptic Wasteland. There was some criticism for Fallout 2 due to the fact it doesn't really do a whole lot to build on the formula, instead more building on the story elements, giving you a much deeper narrative than the previous game. However, despite praising the game, a lot of people at the time considered it a little bit too similar to the first, and also criticized it for a few bugs. Nothing too bad, as it's still considered a classic today, but it's important to mention that it wasn't perfect. Fallout 2 also easily could have pretty much been it for Fallout. The now called Black Isle Studios, the people who were in charge of Fallout 1 and 2, was closed down due to Interplay Entertainment's bankruptcy. During this time, Bethesda acquired the rights to Fallout and began working on a new game. Their first outing with it isn't really that inspiring. Fallout Tactics is a game that in a lot of ways looks like Fallout, however, it's not really very oriented towards a lot of the actual storytelling elements, but more, well, for lack of a better term, tactics-oriented stuff. Fallout Tactics features 3 modes of combat: CTB, ITB, and STB, which is continuous turn-based, individual turn-based, and squad turn-based, and a plot that revolved around the Brotherhood of Steel that, well, isn't considered canonical by anybody who's ever been involved in Fallout. It's not a bad game, but it's just a weird game. It was actually received quite well, although the main criticism was that it wasn't really focused on the things that made Fallout Fallout. So naturally, Bethesda wanted to just make something totally different. And that might sound a little bit wild given the criticism of not really making a Fallout game that was a Fallout game, but they also did want to make sure that although they were going to do something different, it would remain Fallout. So it was back to the drawing board with the plot. They didn't keep what happened in the Tactics game canon, although there are small references to it, making it kind of semi-canon, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is that Bethesda said, let's make this, but like our other games, which at this point included Morrowind and Oblivion, both first-person RPGs that seemingly had very little to do with Fallout, not just aesthetically speaking, but in every systemic manner. 2008's Fallout 3 is a pretty damn interesting synthesis of the original Fallout games and the Bethesda open-world RPG. The game became a shooter, however, it added something called the VAT system, an abbreviation for Vault Tech Assisted Targeting System, which in a lot of ways feels like the turn-based combat of old, however, with a much more, let's say, body part-focused approach, as opposed to simply selecting characters and selecting attacks. Regular real-time first-person shooter-style combat takes place, albeit a little bit slower, and can be paused to use the VAT system, which allows for sort of bullet time attacks to be carried out on various parts of the body. Along those lines, the game has a segmented health system, which includes HP for your body as well as for your limbs. Limb health can be depleted individually, and when depleted, it gives you a negative status effect. For instance, deplete your head HP, you'll have blurred vision. Deplete your leg health, you're not going to be as fast as you used to be, obviously speaking. A few new systems were added. For instance, there was a rudimentary crafting system, and the carryover systems that were used, such as the special system, received minor tweaks but were more or less kept intact in order to maintain continuity between the old Fallout games and Fallout 3. Fallout 3 was praised as an incredibly deep entry to a series that at that point in time had been thought probably dead. And though in certain ways it resembled the previous games, it was a radical departure for the series that worked out. Interestingly enough, Fallout New Vegas is kind of like Fallout 2 to Fallout 3 if you considered it analogous to Fallout 1. Fallout New Vegas' DNA obviously was very similar to Fallout 3's, but an interesting development happened in that Obsidian Entertainment, a company founded by several members that were from the original Black Isle Studios, the team that originally made the Fallout games, was chosen by Bethesda to make the new game. Now obviously it's built to resemble Fallout 3, using a lot of the same technology, but there were some marked improvements. For instance, crafting makes so much more sense in New Vegas than it does in Fallout 3. It's a more robust system that feels much more worth using. The graphics engine, while the same Gamebryo engine used in the first of the Bethesda Fallouts, was improved with some rendering improvements, including various different lighting effects that Obsidian wanted to use for the Las Vegas Strip, and most importantly, the first-person shooting mechanics were made a lot more sturdy and reliable, as well as, well, just plain usable. Fallout New Vegas is in every way an improvement, although it did bring its own bugs and glitches. I generally think of it as a better game, much more quirky, much more interesting, with some of the story elements from the cancelled Fallout 3 that was being worked on by the original studio. Also, narratively speaking, there was more sides, and these sides weren't explicitly good or evil at any time, making repeat playthroughs with different factions a viable and interesting option. And although in a lot of ways New Vegas was kind of the dark horse of the series, storytelling-wise it's probably the best of the Bethesda games, at least in my opinion, with a near endless amount of distractions that serve not actually to distract, but enhance the rest of the game, with so many weird side stories and quirky quests, and still a lot of flaws. New Vegas is a testament to the ideas of the new games, while having a much larger focus on storytelling than Fallout 3. The most recent Fallout game kind of acts as a synthesis of all Fallout games. In a lot of ways it innovates. For instance, there are base building mechanics that can be very detailed and interesting and frankly worth the time on their own. Item and weapon customization is near endless in Fallout 4, and crafting is well above any previous crafting elements in the series. Mechanically speaking, Fallout 4 is easily the best. It did get a little bit of criticism for not really looking like the most amazing thing you've ever seen, but as far as Fallout, it never looked that good. There is one thing I want to talk about with Fallout 4 that I sort of think is a weird result of all of the various evolutions of the game. As technology is improved and storage space for games became near limitless, voicing a protagonist became more and more possible. And despite the fact that there are, yes, a lot of options for conversations in Fallout 4, they pale in comparison to previous Fallout games. Also, though the main narrative of the game is interesting, it feels a little bit scaled back from New Vegas. It's interesting that they got to the point where they were actually allowed to put voices in the protagonist's mouth, but it became less necessary than ever. Certainly the ability to answer a question in more ways, or ask more questions for that matter, would have been a decent reason not to have a voiced protagonist. There's a lot of argument on both sides of that, but I fall squarely on the side of it really would have been nice to be able to further role play a little bit. But that being said, Fallout 4 is still amazing, and the combat, both in VATS and outside of VATS, the actual real-time combat, just works much better. For one, VATS doesn't entirely stop all of the action. There's a slowing, a bullet time effect that sort of makes it feel like you need to make decisions a little bit faster, and that impending urgency just, for whatever reason, makes the battles more thrilling to me. On top of that, the actual first-person real-time shooting is easily the most competent of the 3D series, and paired together is a pretty strong experience overall. Power armor, though a staple of the entire series, became more of a vehicle in this game, rather than just something you put on and wear because it's armor. In fact, it bears mentioning basically because of that. Armor is pretty much a staple in any RPG, but at this point, armor is something you find and hop into and control, like a forklift, except with guns. Obviously, Fallout isn't done either. Fallout has a long way to go. It's a thriving series that keeps adding new mechanics like the base building and the deeper customization of items and weapons, the crafting, and all of the modern game elements keep coming in and yet not being overwhelming. Fallout 4 still feels like Fallout, but I do have hopes for the future in regards to its storytelling and particularly the role-playing, meaning the dialogue, meaning I hope Bethesda, if you happen to hear this by any chance, maybe give us some more options for dialogue. I'm sure the actors would appreciate the extra money, and relatively speaking, I promise you, that is not the big thing in the budget. The next stop we'll be taking in the Fallout series is actually quite a bit earlier in the timeline than the typical time we spend in the post-apocalyptic Wasteland. On top of that, Fallout 76 is going to be an online multiplayer game. Now, apparently, it's not going to forego narrative entirely despite its onlineness, and will follow the player character exiting Vault 76 on Reclamation Day as a part of a plan to recolonize the Wasteland. Supposedly, it's a lot bigger than Fallout 4, but bigger isn't always better, so please don't mess it up, guys. What's your favorite Fallout? Is it one of the classics or one of the more recent ones? Leave us a comment, let us know, and if you like this video, please click like. If you're not subscribed now, it'd be a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and the best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. As always, thank you very much for watching this video on Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at FalconHero, and we'll see you next time right here on gameranx.